Oh, Dr. Deb, I need courage to handle my marriage. Yeah, you do. And you need not only courage, but compassion and honesty and curiosity. What, are you crazy? I don't have compassion for someone who treats me like that, and I'm sure not curious about them. I can't be honest either. I get that. I do. It's hard to have positive energy when things are bad. But in this video, you're going to learn exactly why you need to, why it'll make things better, and how to do it. From Dr. Deb, that's me. Hey, I'm Dr. Deb. Welcome again to my channel. We have the secret to helping you fix a crappy marriage. That's not the channel, that's just this playlist, which we're going to include all the different ways that you have within you the self-energy to handle everything. I'm going to start with courage. And interestingly enough, it's not just the courage to deal with that spouse of yours, it's the courage to deal with yourself. Because the first person that you really need to connect with, love, appreciate, is you. Now, you may say, I don't have any of those feelings for myself, and that totally makes sense because you have been driven by your protectors all these years. As a child, what child could possibly have courage against grown-ups? Grown-ups are really difficult for a child to handle. So they put on bravado. Some of them want to act tough, right? Some kids just cry. Some kids tune out. Some kids become the parent's best friend and take care of the parent. That's actually called a parentified child. But none of those qualities or behaviors is courage. Those behaviors are all different protectors that the child needed because their courage was kind of forced down. So what is courage? Well, let's talk about bravado first. Bravado is fake. It's a protector, a fake protector that makes you look to the world like you're brave when you don't feel brave, and you don't even want to admit to yourself that you don't feel brave. Courage, on the other hand, is authentic. It's saying, I don't feel brave at all, but I'm going to go ahead and do whatever it is that I have to do in order to deal with the problem. So the first thing in yourself, not the first, we're actually up to number 5, right, is courage to face yourself so that you can learn who you are and love who you are. Okay, so now we're going to talk about number 6, compassion. So what's compassion? First of all, your first reaction will probably be, how can I have compassion for somebody who's abused me? Or even if they haven't abused you, you're not getting along and you don't like them. Or you like them, or you love them, but sometimes you hate them. Well, the first person you have to have compassion for is yourself. And a lot of times we don't. We overlook ourselves. Ourselves are less important, which makes sense when you consider the history that we've had where we always had to be on the lookout for what the grown-ups in our life were doing when we were kids so that we could kind of carry the ball ahead of them and not get in trouble with them. We always had to check where we were, a little hyper-vigilant. So who has time for compassion for yourself? And if you're living in a crazy world right now, between your kids and your husband, your parents, and whoever else is driving you nuts, who has time for compassion? There just isn't any. That makes sense too. However, in order for all this to work, you have to have the compassion for yourself. And when you have that compassion for yourself, you then have enough left over for your spouse, your kids, your parents, and all the other people who are making you crazy. And I will tell you, that's not easy. It's not quick. Don't expect to look at this video and say, oh yeah, 1, 2, 3. No, I don't want to give you that impression. But it's doable and it's necessary. And I'll walk you through that step by step. So let's look a little bit more deeply at what compassion for yourself really comes from. Remember, in the last video, I was talking about perspective. Perspective is that big picture look at your whole life. When you see all the forces, all the things that happened, things that were said and done to you, situations you found yourself in, when you see all of that as a big display in front of your eyes and you realize Oh, in that circumstance, I couldn't have handled things differently. It's all I knew. It's all I had with me as a tool, as a resource. I did the best I could. When you see that, then you have room to have compassion for yourself. Then you can stop kicking yourself for not having done all the things you wish you had done. Then you don't have space to say, I was stupid. No, you were a child. Or no, you were too young and inexperienced in life. Even if you were ready after your 20s, you were too young and inexperienced to know how to do better. So that's when you can logically stop kicking yourself. And that's where you make room for compassion. Now, the truth of the matter is this is not a logical process, right? It's an emotional process. So even that isn't enough, which is why I have often asked people to close their eyes and imagine all the fault-finding parts of yourself taking a seat somewhere in the audience. When you're just left with yourself and all those voices that are bothering you are no longer doing that, you have room for compassion, and I want you to feel it. Now, given that space for compassion, with all those parts and protectors moved out of the way, the next step is pretty straightforward. You ask yourself, well, what about my kids? My parents, my spouse? What did they have going on in their lives that impinged upon them to cause them to react and act the way they do? And often people will say to me, I don't care. I don't want to think about them. They hurt me. I wouldn't hurt a fly. I'm a nice person. Why can't they be a nice person? And that's all true too. But they're not being a nice person because they needed to develop protectors that would get them through whatever they were going through. And so even the fact that they're not a nice person now is something you can have compassion for. Like, thank God I came out a nice person, even though I was abused. And they didn't. You can have compassion for that in them. But I know this is hard. As I said, it doesn't happen 1, 2, 3. In fact, the compassion for the other person may take years to develop, and that's normal, and that's okay. Step 1 is ourself. So let's just look at what compassion isn't. One thing it's not is pity. Pity is something that is all about you, really. You look at another person, you see the guy sitting on the sidewalk on a cardboard and dirty and not even connected to reality, and you look at that person and say, wow, I'm so glad that's not me. It's all about yourself. It's not compassion. It's not a bad thing. At least you feel a recognition, a gratitude that you're not that person. That's not a bad thing, but it's not exactly compassion because it is about you. And then we have sympathy. Sympathy is a step closer. I feel for you. I feel how you feel. I feel what you're going through. Again, thank God that's not me, but it's a little bit warmer. It's a little bit more kindly. It's not judgmental of what the other person has been or where they've been. Sympathy is not bad. Then we have empathy. Empathy is wonderful up to a point because empathy is feeling their pain so much that it can hurt you so that you've absorbed too much of their pain. And that's not the goal here either. You don't want to absorb another person's pain. For one thing, it does you no good. For another thing, when you have too much empathy for someone else, then you're not helping them to stand on their own 2 feet. You're not teaching them anything, and you're really not giving them anything. You're kind of making them dependent on you. But compassion is another level up. It's feeling for yourself and feeling for them. Now, nowhere do I want you to get the idea of taking abuse. Oh, I have so much compassion for what they went through. I'll just let them bite me and put me down. No. The point is that for you to feel compassion starts with yourself, which means self-care. You can set boundaries for the other person, a real safety zone. Maybe you have to move out if it's dangerous. Maybe you have to move out if you're becoming verbally abused. With self-compassion, if there are moments that your part can be rational and you can say, look, I don't want this to go on. It's not healthy. Maybe you should start watching Dr. Deb's videos so that you get some sense of where we need to go, because this is not going to be good to keep up.
What if
if. I'm afraid. I'm afraid to go ahead and set that boundary. I'm afraid of what's going to happen. That's where the courage that we talked about comes in. And I have another tool that's within yourself, and that's called curiosity. All right, we are up to number 7, curiosity. So the first person, you probably know what I'm going to say now, right? You need to get to know and be curious about is yourself. Let's take a story. I'm going to make up this whole thing because I think it's great. Jane and Jim went to a party, and Jane was flirting with some other guys, or at least she was laughing and giggling and having a great time talking to people at this party. And Jim was, of course, angry. Now, let's look at this. The first thing you have to know is what curiosity isn't. The next day he says to her, and why were you flirting with those guys at the party? Is that curiosity? He's asking why. But does he want to know the reason why? That's not curiosity. See, the one thing that Jim doesn't want to be is vulnerable. He doesn't want to let down his pants in front of her and say, I was hurt. I'm your husband. Why wouldn't you be talking to me? Why would you be flirting with those people? That would be curiosity. That would be honest. He wants to know. This other one, the why weren't you stuff, that's bullying. And that's what he does all the time because he learned as a child not to be vulnerable because he would get in big trouble for that. If he cried, he'd get slapped. If he said that he was hurt by kids at school, he'd be made fun of. There was no way that he could be vulnerable. He learned to be the exact opposite, aggressive, bullying. But those are what? Protectors. And they keep that vulnerable part of himself way down. They don't want that vulnerability to get in the way because then he'd be hurt. Now, here's the interesting question about curiosity. Does Jim even know this about himself? Does Jim know this about himself? The answer is no. He has no awareness. He thinks he's just bullying because he's bullying. That's the way I am. Take it or leave it. That'll be his simple-minded answer. If you asked him, if you put him to the test, well, why would you yell instead of being honest? You know, I had a client, we talked about emotions, and he said, do you think my family thinks I'm a robot? I said, great question. Why don't you ask? Start with your wife. He said, oh no, Dr. Deb, I'm proving your point now. That is the one question I would never ask my wife. And we both laughed because he got the idea. He understood finally what he's been doing is covering up his vulnerability. And he finds it actually impossible, not almost impossible, but actually impossible to do otherwise. Of course, as we work together, that'll change. So Jim has no curiosity about himself at all because he doesn't even realize that there is a self that's vulnerable underneath all those aggressors. Now, here's Jane's point of view. Jane doesn't like being bullied. So of course she's flirting with someone else. Not that it's right to flirt with someone else, but I can understand her protectors want to give her a little pleasure in a very, very dark place in her life. So of course, if she's going to be made to laugh by somebody that's being friendly and fun, why not? Now, could she even explain that to Jim? No. Not only can't she explain it to him, but if she and I were to have a conversation about it, she'd have a great deal of trouble explaining it because she'd know that Jim himself wouldn't get it, which is why Jim has to be watching these videos too. There's no way around it. Yes, you can work on yourself and that's a great thing, but your Jims, all of them, have to be in on the deal. Let's get back to someone being afraid to talk to their spouse. Here's where the curiosity comes in. It's all about being curious about who you are. For me, it's because I was taught to be the good girl who could not disappoint my dad. For someone else, it might be fear of being wrong because that someone might put you down. Or maybe it's just a fear you can't pinpoint the reason for. But search inside yourself with curiosity. That's how you get to know who you are. Jim doesn't know himself. Jane doesn't know herself either. When you stop and think about it, was Jane really very smart in her decision that flirting would make her feel very good for a few minutes? I mean, it doesn't do anything for her marriage. It's not communicating anything to her husband about what she really wants. She wants peace, she wants love, she wants kindness, she doesn't want to be bullied, but she hasn't been able to say that to her husband. Or if she said it in those words, it didn't register. And she's not looking for another way to do it. That's the problem. So what is necessary for curiosity to happen? And I think for curiosity to happen, the first thing that's necessary will be number 8, honesty. I think a person needs to have that feeling of wanting to get to know themselves. Well, why did I flirt? Was that helpful? Did it help me? Did it help my marriage? Or was it the same as drinking, cheating, drugs, overworking, shopping, any of these escape mechanisms? Was it really the same as that? Yeah, probably. So did it help? It was like a tiny, tiny drop of relief in a sea of pain. Not so good for the long term. Jim, the same question he could ask. Why did I need to blow up? Why do I blow up out of nowhere? See, that curiosity must have underneath it honesty. He and Jane have to want to get to know who they are underneath all these protectors. You know what's the most interesting here? These people, Jane and Jim, they're married 20 years. They don't know themselves and they don't know each other. They first needed the curiosity underlying the honesty so that they could ask those questions. Who are you? Who am I? Why would I act that way? I can't begin to tell you how important all this is. Since this is the 4th of our playlist, I wanted to kind of go over the summary of it. In episode 1, we blew at you all 21 qualities of self-energy. Yes, there are 8 C's, but there's so many more. In episode 2, I tiptoed into the water with you a little bit, how to find yourself, and I gave you 5 ways. But in episode 3, we plunged right into getting started with all of the ways, and we did 4 of them. Goals, connection, joy, and perspective. And every one of them will lead you to connection in the marriage, provided both of you are working on it. But at least start with one person because it will be so powerful when you do it right. And finally, in this episode, yes, you need courage, but you really also want compassion, curiosity, and honesty. They are so powerful. For the next video, we're going to start with kindness.